So you spent hours and hours leveling, panning, processing, affecting, and automating your mix. Now what? In this movie, we'll go over the final mixdown, or in Logic Pro 10 terms, the bounce. Before starting our mixdown or bounce, we need to make sure a few things are in place. We'll need to set the start and end points for our project. Logic bounces from the start point, indicated here by bar 1, to the end point, indicated by the left pointing arrow in the bar ruler. We zoom way out, and we can see that. It's way down here. Or in the LCD, the project end we can see is at bar 130. We can either click and drag downward in the LCD, or grab the project end and pull it in. If you leave your project end too far to the right, you'll end up with a bunch of silence written into your final bounce file. But you also want to make sure it isn't too close to the end of your audio regions, because you don't want to cut anything off. Be aware that if you're using any time-based effects like reverb or delay, they could still be ringing out after the last region ends. So I think we're safe if we put it around bar 74. Now you want to make sure you don't have any tracks soloed or muted before you bounce. Logic bounce is exactly what you're hearing when you hit play. So if you forgot that you had a muted track, make sure it's unmuted now, otherwise it won't end up in your final mix. Also, all the levels and automation you set in your mixing process will be part of the final bounce. You can bounce in 3 different ways. One is to go to File, Bounce, Project or Section. You can also type Command B, and the third way is to click the bounce button in your output fader. I should point out also that if you have a cycle selected, it'll bounce only that area. So you either want to have it deselected, or if you want to bounce that area, you can just select your cycle length, and in this case, it would only bounce from where your cycle was currently active. But let's type C to deactivate our cycle, so we'll bounce the whole song. Okay, so if I click the bounce button, or any of the other methods I chose, you'll be brought to this window. This is our bounce dialog window. The coolest thing about bouncing in Logic is that you can make 4 different types of files in one bounce. I love that. It's a real time saver. These 4 types of files are PCM, which stands for Pulse Code Modulation. This is the uncompressed file type. File formats for PCM are AIFF, WAV, or CAF. I recommend using PCM settings, especially if you're planning to use this mix in a professional, best-sounding way, because it's uncompressed. And the best way to set the resolution and sample rate are to follow whatever the resolution and sample rate you had currently going on in your song. That way you're not lowering the resolution of what you originally had when you first recorded. So if you were recording at 24-bit, you want to keep the resolution at 24-bit. And whatever your recording session sample rate was, you keep it 44.1, or 48, or 96, or 192 kilohertz if that's what you recorded at. Remember, we can go into our project settings. Let me close this window for a second. Go into our project settings to see what the current sample rate is of our song if I go to audio. And here we see it's 44.1. So back in the bounce dialog, I'll keep it at 24-bit, 44.1, and that way I'm not down converting from where it was to begin with. Interleave file type means it'll create one file with a left-right component in it. That's probably fine. Most of the time, that's what you want to do. Dithering is a process that gets the most out of your down conversion. So if you are going from 24-bit to 16-bit, we'd want to choose POW-R dither number 2. That's the best for stereophonic material. But in this case, because we're keeping it at 24-bit, we're not going to do any dithering. If your mix is going to be mastered, it's best to do that kind of stuff in the mastering process. Finally, down here, we can choose to bounce our song in real time or offline. Offline's great because you don't have to sit through the entire song. It does it a lot faster than the real-time length of the song. You can choose Include Audio Tail just to make sure you get that reverb trails at the end of your song and you don't cut them off. And in the Normalize section, you can choose Overload Protection only just to make sure it doesn't clip, or you can turn it on to completely normalize your mix to a louder level. I'd only use these settings if you're rushed to get an unfinished demo to someone and you don't have time to mix it or master it the way you want yourself. Because if you mixed your song right, it shouldn't be overloading the output fader. And you shouldn't need to normalize it. It should already be the right level. So far we've only talked about the PCM settings. We can also simultaneously mix to MP3, if I check this box, and then I've got our typical MP3 bitrate settings. You might be familiar with these from iTunes. So here you can choose, say, 256 kilobytes per second as your audio quality for your stereo mix. And you have some other variables down here that are all about encoding an MP3. I usually choose 256. MP4A is Apple's own MP3-like codec that's used for iTunes downloads. Here you can adjust these rates too. And lastly, we can also burn to a CD straight from Logic if you have a CD burner in your Mac. Here again, you should only choose to dither if you're going down to 16-bit. But it turns out CDs are natively 16-bit, so you may want to choose a dither if your song is at 24-bit here. So we're going to bounce this time just to PCM and MP3, so I'll uncheck these last two boxes. And once we make sure everything's right here, we can click Bounce. You'll be brought to a new window where we can choose a location and a name for our bounce, and Output12 is not a very descriptive name. But as you see, Logic brought us right to the Bounces folder in our current project folder, which is a good place to put our bounces. So let's rename this, Say Yes, Final Mix, and maybe I'll put today's date, August 30th, and I'll click Bounce. So this is the offline bounce happening. It's going faster than real time. You can see the playhead moving through our tracks, and it went beyond the song end to make sure it includes the tail, converting the MP3, and we're done. So now I'm going to go and look in our Chapter 13 folder in Bounces, and there's our two mixes. One is the full res AIFF, and one's the MP3. Let's double click the MP3, and it'll open up in iTunes, and we can listen to our mix. So bouncing marks the last stage of the complete mix process for this song. Enjoy your work, and now let's start on the next song.